heard about the reform situation, the military-industrial capabilities, with emphasis on a major question that arose because of what happened yesterday. We've discussed diplomacy regarding Russia's war against Ukraine. Minsk, whatever value it may have, seems to be keeping European countries involved. And some of those countries think the greatest threat facing them is Trump. Interesting. Not Putin or China. We've heard about the Russian disinformation campaign now being on steroids, and the suggestions on how we might be able to counter it with something unique, the truth. We have heard a bit about the multinational partnerships and bilateral partnerships, and now we're going to move to terrorism, something that Russia is very, very expert in. Indeed, our speaker, Dr. Phil Karber, most of us, and people who attend this session periodically, know him as a military strategist, know that he's been on the front lines in Ukraine many, many, many times, an advisor in the Defense Department and other places. But in 1970, he wrote a book about terrorism, perhaps the first a chapter about terrorism that is maybe more relevant today than it was then. And so we will move now with Dr. Karber, terrorism and Russia's bloody attacks on Ukraine and elsewhere.
Well, at least I didn't get introduced as a noted terrorist. When Walter asked me to address this topic, I went back to the report that General Wesley Park and I gave, which now seems a long time ago, 5.5 years, 6 years ago. Closed session before the U.S. Congress. Full committee of the House Armed Services Committee, 3 hours. And the title of our presentation was Russian State-Sponsored Terrorism. As I went back looking at that report, and consider the dates, literally the summer of 14. That's before anybody arrived, before Russian winter offensive, before a whole series of long and bloody battles. I asked us, did we have it right? And I think, considering how early it was, we did. By the way, we also looked at the, literally within a week of the Malaysian shoot-down, and had it exactly right. We just took the international community 5 years and an effective response to come up to San Francisco. I'm not trying to say go over pressure or anything, but a lot of the problem that the West has, and Ukraine has suffered for it, is its response to state-sponsored terrorism. So I went back to this, and I'm going to hit you with a bunch of slides. Well, not the whole brief. Our presentation for Congress was 299 pages long. No, I'm not going to brief it all, but I'm going to just show illustrations from it. These were the main elements of our report, and you'll notice there was chapter 4, section 4 was on terrorism. A couple points of why we thought it was important then, and I still believe it important, to have a bipartisan approach. As you'll see in my last concluding slide, which is the only new slide I've added to this deck for today, it is, I believe, American national security depends on a bipartisan approach. And frankly, the survival of Ukraine. And a second issue is sort of the way one approaches it. There's a lot of analysts, there's a lot of people who look at stuff, but we concluded that it had to be upfront and personal, and see it from the front lines. So we did. We got to piece that Clark and I had been tasked by the chairman of the House Armed Services Committee to write an evaluation of the administration's early, this was April 14, non-lethal approach to Ukraine. And we called it like we saw it. And it was not flattering to the administration. It certainly wasn't helpful to Ukraine. Subsequently, there was a lot of, it built in momentum and led to a bipartisan letter signed by every member of the House Armed Services Committee, without exception, and also members of the Senate joining in, to the administration to have them change. So, what have we learned? I'm going to go back and try and ask that question and say, well, if we learned that, it's been evident, still is, why don't we call it like we see it? Russia has not been attributed with the title sponsor state terrorism. Despite the fact that assassinations are still going on. Roman Mushkevich, who was supposed to be here, a friend of mine, has car blown up. You can actually see the video of the guy walking along with his dog, stops the car, plants the bomb. Unfortunately, he did something wrong because he blew himself up in the car. Luckily, the dog escaped. Recently, there was an interesting incident in Western Ukraine where a team from Poland goes in and attacks a Hungarian cultural center. And when the dust settles, those guys are all Moscow guys. I can give you, we're now in the disengagement process. And yet some of the fiercest battles, certainly in the last couple of years, have gone on while being disengaged. There's still several thousand people who are missing in the Donbass area, presumably in the bottom of some coal mine. So, why aren't we spelling it like it sounds? That's the kind of question. So let's just start with Crimea. Oh yeah, we had the little green men. I don't know who they are. 3 months later, he goes on national television in Russia and says, oh yeah, those were my guys. And oh, by the way, I went on nuclear alert. And oh, by the way. But at the time, he had just enough ambiguity so that 18 months later, major news outlets in the world were still saying the alleged Russian invasion of Crimea. It's easy enough to see. And we tend to forget it had a major military impact, not only on Ukraine, but our security of our own allies in Europe and our own forces, including Navy and Air Forces, and operating in the Black Sea. When the Russians undertook the campaign in the Donbass, by the way, they took, of my recollection, the number 3, number 4 man who would help organize the Crimean operation and transported him into the Donbass, along with a number of the old Comintern types, agent in charge. I describe it as the most lethal weapon in the Russian hybrid arsenal because they may look older than me or be decrepit, have little glasses, wear a sweater. They got plenty of muscle behind them. But their job in every town, in every locality, is to know who's the opposition, who has to be off, who can be bought. And they then serve as the recruiting element for local unrest. So you have basically 4 stages in the Donbass. Agitation, agitprop campaign, then seizures, then active insurgency, and then proxy war. If you sort of plot the level of violence, activity was one, there was a lot of public protest, and early it was sort of the dominant. Now there are some reasons for it. You know, the Ukrainian parliament exercised a sort of excitement and perhaps hubris, declared Ukrainian sort of abolished the Russian language for 3 days, and the Russian propaganda picked that up and ran with it, played it like a Stradivarius, along with other exaggerated forms, you know, Ukrainians killing babies, crucifying poor 5-year-olds. I mean, it just went on and on. Next came the violence and the seizures of the facilities. And then, essentially, the violence not only against Ukrainian forces or security troops or border guards, but also against local people. I think it was the mayor of Solyansk, who was sort of pro-separatist, and ended up being chained in the basement of the city hall in Slovyansk, because she lied or disagreed with some element of the People's Republic authorities. So it starts very slow. Protest, a couple seizures, and expands, and the targets are very clear. Why do they go after the local state authorities? Because they have the local state government and oblast townships have the records of everybody. So you know where everybody is. And the second thing, you go after media, and the third thing, you go after weapons and disarm the police. Then you recruit volunteers. When Yanukovych had been from the Donbass. It was kind of by reputation in that period at least, kind of, you know, Mayor Daley, good old boy, you know, yeah, he corrupt, he's kind of the local people. He gets elected, and he brings a lot of, as part of patronage, which was not unique to him, by the way, brings a lot of people from the Donbass up to Ukraine, up to Kiev, and they, several thousand of them, and they participate in the security forces. Well, when Maidan happens, they're the forces of law and order. When he flees, all of a sudden they're going, oh, we may be facing war crime trials for what we did. So what do? They go home. And when they go home, who meets them in the local town but the resident agent in charge? And says, we will pay you $3,000 a month. That was the then going number. We'll take you to the Rostov training area. We'll equip you with modern equipment. And you come back and defend it. And when they came back, in July, you talk to Ukrainian tough guys on the Ukrainian military side, and they will tell you they were some of the best fighters. They were motivated, they had modern equipment, and they were well trained. So there's this military aspect to it that tends to, it's where the terrorism is part of a military campaign. And if there's a big message I have here, that's certainly one of them. Some of the cool guys that were there, no more Ukrainian than I am. Just flip through. So pretty soon you end up having these seizures. You take over key airports. The airports were critical for several reasons. One, it offered them the potential, and in the summer, later in the summer, the Russians tried, but it failed. And I'll tell you why, but they were going to introduce separatist aircraft fighters, Su-25s and Su-fencers. They were actually badged in separatist colors on the wings. They were, of course, not going to be flown out of here, but that would give plausible argument that the separatists had their own air force. And they would be flying, just like in the Korean War, planes were flying out of Russia over North Korea, same model. The second issue was it gave them, since they didn't have a port, it gave them an international access that would provide legitimacy. But they ended up being fought over, and so they were so destroyed that they were never able to take advantage of it. Creating a attacks on infrastructure essentially created a separatist zone. So you had this series of activities. There was no shortage. This is July of 2014. There is no shortage of evidence and data about Russian fingerprints on this. First UAVs are coming in. By the way, some of these were had American ITAR controlled parts. Remember, today we still will not give Ukrainians weapons that are ITAR controlled. Well, so happened we'd given it to a non-NATO state ally, or given them access to it, and they turned around and rented and then sold it to Russia and became Russia's one of the most effective early UAVs. But it's not small arms. Main battle tanks. There's no dates. So the Russians at first tried to play a little goals. They go, okay, oh, it's a T-64. Well, the T-64 was manufactured in Ukraine because the Kharkiv tank plant produced the T-64s, Najik Tagil to produce the T-72s. But the records show that by serial number, these vehicles were never serviced in Ukraine. The Russians brought them in to disguise them. Again, slightly covered up airborne markings. So, systematic wiping out of the border guards along the border. By threat, intimidation, assassination of some of the leaders. Same, by the way, of the local police in Donbass were loyal. And then when that didn't completely work, artillery fire across the border. Bringing in mercenaries. So one of the big successes of Putin was as prime minister prior to becoming president. But probably one of the reasons what made him popular in 1999 was his success in the Second Chechen War. And he had done a couple of innovative things, one of which was he bought off Kharkiv and turned him and roughly 1/3 of the Chechens against the other Chechens. By the way, today Kharkiv provides Putin with 40,000 security guys in Russia. Sort of interesting. The Chechens were a source of mercenaries early on, along with the Cossacks and so forth. Again, no absence of evidence. Senior Russian military guys. There, man, paid with their life. Advertising. Guy goes on YouTube, posts on YouTube the assassination of Ukrainian officers by shooting them in the back because it's part of a coercive deal to get his girlfriend and some others released from the authorities. Abductions, firebombings, thousands missing. Amnesty International. Creating fake suicide bombers. So you place a bomb in somebody's car with a radio detonator. Well, this one was a taxi. He gets to the border post, he gets to the control post. He doesn't know he's a bomb-carrying guy. And then it detonates. And there's people who are willing to sacrifice themselves for the cause. Oh, these guys are cool. So they'd love to give press conferences to the press. Oh, yes, we're the people's democracy. Same picture, same room, torturing prisoners. And bragging about it. So other cool guys, the Russians. This guy liked to post pictures of him cutting the heads off of little puppies. I'm not making that up. It isn't just Ukrainians they did it to. Those guys on their own side. At least a dozen major separatist leaders have now been offed. And they, not the Ukrainian government, they claim, or their friends and fellow travelers claim it's the Russian GRU who's been knocking them off because they were under control or whatever. By the way, this is on a video. And you can actually watch the video, and the Chechens are same group, by the way, I showed her, 15 yards away, eating lunch. And a couple of them are playing volleyball with this guy's art. This is not kind, ladies and gentlemen, terrible. So, see, by the summer, Russian units are entering. But the seizures of the territory and the control is actually not just a thing to create an independent entity. It is essentially creating a path for invasion. By the way, one of the models the Russians used was the Zapad exercises that had been around against NATO in the north. So this was a compilation of a number of Zapad exercises, which came back, by the way, the year that Putin became president. If you flip it around, you just take that exercise and turn it upside down, same one applied. By the way, we have a copy of the Russian war plan that lays out these same axes. It starts here in the Donbass, and it gets to the center, and then finished off with a good man against a war plan that is generally validated. I gave a presentation at Harvard on it, on the evidence on it. So, in the spring, Russian army's getting ready for invasion. So, prior, in January, the Russian army, so one of the things, so when the Russians had been part of the Warsaw Pact, they had Poles, Czechs, East Germans, Hungarians, so forth, and they had armies sitting in those forward areas. At the end of the Cold War, those disappear. But it essentially left the territory opposite Ukraine free, because Ukraine was sort of presumed to be an ally. So there was actually not a lot of Russian forces, but they're not in high state of readiness. It's white, they're relatively low, and remember, at least 50% of their manning is conscripts, which Putin's other innovation in the Second Chechen War was to lead the conscripts out of the combat because they were not well trained, they didn't want to be there, and their mothers protested. So those were not high readiness combat units. So the Russians really weren't ready to go right away. By February, they start moving units down into the invasion of Crimea. But with airborne units, it moved way down. Our intelligence saw this. It's just the reports that went to the National Security Council said, well, yes, the Russians are getting ready for it. They have the potential, but they wouldn't risk Western ire and all the agreements and so forth. So our conclusion is that they would not actually do an invasion of Crimea. So by the time Clark and I get there, we're actually watching these Russian units along the border. But if you notice what's going on, if I can back it up for a second, now look at the Ukrainians. So they're in peacetime posture, old Russian concerns. Nobody believed the Ukrainian army was going to get out of it. I mean, essentially they turned it into a territorial force and manned at 50%. They were considered ready if they had 60% of their manpower and half the vehicles could make it out of the gate. Billions of dollars worth of modern aircraft sitting on runways that hadn't been flown in 10 years. Tires flat, unmaintained. So, but that army starts moving. By March, they're getting up to the border. Then the conflict in the Donbass starts, and yes, we now know from intercepts that the command in Rostov sends a message to the. By the way, today it's all encrypted and wireless in fiber optic communication, so we can't listen. But at the time, we knew that they sent a message to Moscow and said, if you want us to go, we better go now, because as this army falls in and starts digging in, it's going to be a much tougher fight than we thought. The message comes back a couple days later, the general staff to the command, and says, the president has decided to let's see how things go in the Donbass and see if that won't draw the Ukrainian army in and open up other avenues. So one of the hardest problems, we all use the word deterrence, but deterrence is not a physical issue, it's a psychological phenomenon. It's very hard to prove. But it's interesting. This is a case where we actually have evidence of deterrence working. This is the old deal, the story about the drunk who's driving down the road, and the cop stops him, and he's hanging a yellow umbrella out of his car. And the cop says, well, why are you driving with this yellow umbrella? He says, well, it keeps the elephants from falling out of the sky. And the cop says, well, I don't see a yellow, I don't see it works. So we tend to assume that deterrence works until it's challenged. Well, this is the case we know that the Ukraine army moved in and the Russians decided not to do the invasion. All right. So this creation was essentially creating a path that was more than halfway to the Dnieper, to cut the country in half. It was an invasion highway, and it was intended as an invasion highway. So Ukraine did what nobody, I don't think the Ukrainians didn't expect to be able to do it, and certainly nobody in the West, and I don't think the Russians did either, would get that force up and get ready to fight. We all know that Ukraine basically ignored its military, but when you look at the numbers, it's just, and we can all whine and cry about Budapest, but Ukraine had a lot of stuff. They didn't take care of it. A few people sold it off and made some money out of it, and left the country basically in deep, deep trouble. So this was the actual Russian war plans. Our conclusions to the House Armed Services Committee. U.S. Ambassador told Clark and I that it was the last week of March. He was one of the first people we met when we were invited to come to Kiev. He said, Clark asked me, how long the Ukrainian army is going to fight? He said, well, they'll put in they'll put in a resistance for a day or two. And then they'll figure out some arrangement and I'll quit. So next week I'm down, so Clark says, I'm going off to see you. You get to the front. So I'm done with first unit I was with the Zabrowski's 95th Air Assault. And some of you heard me tell the story, but I never tire of telling. I'm looking across the field glasses and I'm seeing huge amount of Russian equipment. I go, how long can you hold this position? Light infantry, no anti-tank weapon. I was going, anti-tank mines? No, the Americans paid us to get rid of them. A handful of mortars. How long can you hold this position? He looks back at me with this wry little smile of his. He said, to the last man. So a couple of weeks later, I'm debriefing in the embassy in Kiev because we weren't allowing any of our attachés or intelligence people to go to the front. And they're saying, oh, yeah, what'd you see? Well, I bet some guys are going to fight. So, you notice, by the way, that Clark and I were the first ones to push for javelin. So Ukraine is depending on the West. So very strong messages came from Washington and Bonn and elsewhere in Europe. We'll take care of the Russians. Don't do anything nasty. Don't do anything provocative. We'll take care of it. And the Ukrainians put up with it. And they ended up getting through electing a president, which, by the way, Putin said publicly that the election that Poroshenko was elected wouldn't happen. They tried a ceasefire, violated. So they said, okay, well, we're going to try and clean things up. So they launched what they call a terrorist operation. Now is not the time for bluster. The situation in Ukraine, like crises in many other parts of the world, does not have easy answers nor a military solution. Excuse the language. Bullshit. The United States and its allies will not hesitate to use 21st century tools. 21st century tool. What is a 21st century tool? It's a limp response to somebody who's carrying a bigger weapon than you are, or is willing to use a weapon you're not. To use accountable for 19th century behavior. So, and you can find Merkel saying as well. So, spend time. Oh, we got to communicate. It's obvious we have a failure to communicate here. If we just talk more, it will convince them the error of their ways. So, I don't know. Maybe Merkel and Putin were having phone sex, but it didn't produce anything in terms of Ukraine. Sanctions. I'll be the first to say that sanctions hurt the Russian economy. But there's no evidence that sanctions inhibited them from carrying on and intensifying military aggression and the state-sponsored terrorism was part of it. So, a few weeks before Clark and I, actually a month before Clark and I went before the House, Putin publishes a mobilization order. By the way, I've probably given this briefings that include that slide several hundred times now, but primarily else through NATO and U.S. And to the military audience, how many people knew about the Putin mobilization order of June? I've never had more than a half dozen total in all those briefings admit that they knew about it. You can read it on the presidential website, by the way. And that involved creating humanitarian convoys that would then send supplies. I think we're on the 50th or 60th humanitarian convoy now. So the peak of that mobilization, so that the members in the hearing said, well, when do you expect a Russian invasion? Well, I'm not Nostradamus. I can't bring it into it or not. Remember, this is July 23rd. So, but Putin had this mobilization order, and past Russian military requirements mobilization involves 60 days. So if they're ready to go, I would estimate it would be another month from now. I was off by a day. It's 24th of August when they formally intervened in the South. Poroshenko raised an interesting question in this period. He said, can't we get help? We don't want gifts. We would like to offer it. We believe we have strategic territory. And by the way, the Walters Conference last fall, General Zembrowski laid out a modern or updated version of this.
Blank repeated it today.
And today, this is a quid pro quo in your strategic interest and ours. I'll leave that unremarked. You can read it. So, what are the lessons when we look back on it? It's the last one. This is the only new one for this. State-sponsored terrorism is violence committed under the guise of ambiguity and hidden responsibility to reduce a state's exposure and vulnerability. Russian state-sponsored terrorism is seen by them as a military instrument and part of a multi-stage campaign. Multi-stage military instrument. Organized, ran, and controlled by the military. Stage one, information warfare works because it exploits target vulnerabilities, political and ethnic in particular, and compounded by a lack of recognition, weak response. Why did I put defensive there? The only serious way to combat information, particularly if you go to disinformation, the only serious way to do it is to go on the offense. By the way, the U.S. military today have entire units, battalions focused on information warfare, and they are not allowed to practice offensive information warfare. They're not even allowed to put Russia or China as the potential opponent. Stage two, terrorism, assassination, bombings, torture, taking hostage, etc. Provide the coercive teeth that empower information, disinformation campaigns into social terror. Right out of Stalin's book in the 20s and the 30s. And that's exactly what's happened in the People's Republics of Luhansk and Donetsk. Stage three. Oh, I skipped. Disinformation warfare exploits modern media and trashes belief in the truth. So you see it over and over again where the Russians basically just put enough noise out there. One quick example. A couple years ago, there was a big explosion out in the suburbs of Donetsk. I mean, so big that the explosion knocked windows out several kilometers circumference. And there's speculation. Was it an ammo dump that accidentally blew up? Did the Ukrainians target it? Was it was a Russian or separatist Russian ammunition dump? But a big explosion. The next day, the Russians publish a piece that goes all around the world within 24 hours. Millions and millions of it. NATO satellite detects nuclear event over Donetsk. Yes, it was a NATO satellite. Yes, it was over Donetsk on the date. And yes, it was a nuclear event. It was a satellite catching the image of the sun rising. The article never mentions that latter part. No one, to my knowledge, has an official capacity has ever gone out and walked out. But once it goes around, you get millions and millions of people look at it. It was just like. Third, infrastructure destruction, seizure of government facilities, creates creation of a People's Republic, creates sanctuary, legitimacy, and diffuses U.S. Russian responsibility. Oh, we're just protecting the People's Republic. Oh, there was a referendum. Oh, yeah, so it was fake, so we just pre-printed the ballots. It's okay. It's now Crimea, it's not our. They decided to be with us. We're innocent. Fourth stage, sanctuary provides cover for proxy military assistance, proxy war, and a path for major invasion. Sanctions hurt Russian economy, but did not inhibit Russian state-sponsored terrorism. Western timidity, prevarication, did not stop Russian aggression. It emboldened it. Ukrainian military unexpectedly rose to the challenge and deterred. Their performance today is still underappreciated and undermined by Western reformer disinformation. You go, oh, Karber, that's pretty rough. Oh, yeah. So, Rand Corporation did the infamous report on reform of the Ukrainian military. The team of whom refused to meet with Ukrainian General Staff. The author of it and her deputy, while that report is sitting on the President of Ukraine's desk and endorsed by the United States government, were writing op-eds in Washington, D.C. arguing against military assistance to Ukraine. Russian state-sponsored terrorism requires serious military response. It is a military tool. Yes, you want to have the whole panoply of assets in your response bag. I'm not saying you want to use a military weapon. It's the only response. But you leave it out of your response bag and you just undermine your own ability. Russian state-sponsored requires serious military response. So by my count, the Russians have introduced 3,600 major combatant weapons. I'm talking about tanks, armored personnel carriers, heavy artillery, multiple rocket launchers, surface-to-surface missiles, and air defense, vehicle-mounted, radar-directed air defense system. And what did we get? Now, remember, I'm a javelin advocate. We sent 36. And you ask anybody with a military background, is that really proportionate? There's no substitute for a bipartisan approach for U.S. security and survival of Ukraine. Unfortunately, we have less of that today than we did in 2014. And I think Garrett just summed it up right. We're not deceived. We only deceive ourselves. Thank you.
We have a few minutes if there are some questions.
Well, I'm going to start
Walter?
with one question. You've done this elegantly for a while with us. And I wanted to, and you've known this First, just wanted to ask you, was there any point at which our own, aside from the fact that you've really put this now as a matter of state-sponsored terrorism, there are two parts to this. One, a military part, and then a state terrorist part, which I separate because that may require a different kind of legislation if we were to ever come after the Russians as state-sponsored terrorists. The first part is that when you were watching all that equipment, and you were watching them with a lack of equipment, I know the first response by you and Wesley might have been, by General Clark might have been, that Yanukovych and the boys just simply sold it off or didn't have it. Was there any point at which you understood or you saw the fact that over time the Americans and the Europeans had talked about, especially in terms of Budapest, we brought this up at the Budapest conference, that aside from disarming on a nuclear level, we had also had the conventional forces reduction thing imposed on us because we were the western flank of the Soviet Union, and the Balts and we had to reduce by about 60 or 70%, or the Russians withdrew it into the inside. So when they threw stuff at us, they had a whole bunch of surplus, and our guys just really didn't have that. Was that? Could you see it, or was that something that was a factor? That's the first question. Did we understand it? The people on the ground, aside from you and Clark, who were really there in the front line, saw you told me once that Zabrowski had a couple of machine gun and mortars to stop all that. The second question is on state-sponsored terrorism. What was the reaction of the Congress when they heard? Because I think you were already saying that at that time.
That's a controversy.
Yeah, I was going to say, you were saying it. Did anybody come along and say, okay, so let's try some sort of, I'm not quite saying global Magnitsky, which is what we're playing with now, but did anybody say, this looks like state-sponsored terrorism, because it is. I mean, it's assassinations, it's bombings, it's provocations, and so on and so forth, diversions, disinformation. Did anybody actually in Congress decide or say, well, let's do something about it in terms of legislation? Those are the two questions I wanted to know.
So let me take the last one first. It was a 3-hour session, so I may have missed it, but I don't believe it came up in that discussion. Clark and I ended up doing 6 or 7 reports to Congress. It became, and maybe this was even our own fault, we became obsessed with the idea of breaking the lethal barrier. And so we tended to focus on that rather than political statements or, legislation on that stuff. And even then it took us 3.5 years, and how many Ukrainian dead before the first challenge. Though we did have discussions at the NSC and the State Department in that period, summer of 14, about states, actually between April and, because the administration itself was moving. There were good people in the Obama administration. Parker was not around for Congress, considered a hero. Karber was at the time, and even Tony Macon. I took Tony on it in public, and the newspaper made him back down. So I probably didn't earn any kudos from him. But later he also switched. Rose Gagnon. see and militarizing and so forth. There's a tendency to not want to confront them directly because they're a big power, and particularly with Russia. And we saw that over and over and over. So somehow they get a free pass at confronting us, but we don't get a free pass at, or we can't reciprocate. And so the idea, dramatically, we would talk about it, the terrorist activity, and it was, well, you know, you could always, well, you know, is it GRU or is it some guys who are out of control? Oh, the Ukrainians have been accused of terrorism too. And it just goes on and on and on. But the real bottom line there is people don't want to, excuse the phrase, man up and go, hey, dude, we got your fingerprints on it. You keep it up, and here's what's going to happen. It's not a threat, it's a promise. It's your choice. You want to play this game, we can play it. And we can play it tougher and longer than you can. And by the way, look what happened in Afghanistan when we finally got going. But unless you want to do that, people, it's very, very hard for people to respond. To your first question, Ukraine got rid of at least double what was required under the CFE. And some of it was really silly. I mean, some of it was, you know, a few people selling stuff off. A lot of it was just what? I mean, you see, it breaks the heart. You see 100 reasonably modern fighters, MiG-29, Su-24s. And I mean, at least you could have put them, you know, and covered them up and you know, done minimal weather preparation. And instead, just literally rot. So yes, there was OSCE. By the way, I personally think, I don't know this, but I speculate that you know, under Lugar and then Senator Obama went to Ukraine and visited Ukrainian demilitarization. And Obama at the time made a number of disparaging remarks about the sloppiness and the poor state of it and so forth. So my impression is that that trip had an enormously deep impact on him, on Ukraine's approach to weapons, security, and so it may have also influenced his. In the end, by the last year, everybody in the administration except him and Susan Rice were in favor of going through the legal aid method, and he wouldn't do it. Yes, ma'am.
This is going off of the previous question, but the U.S. State Department actually has a list of state sponsors of terrorism, and Russia's not on that list. There are many countries which are sponsoring either terrorist groups or other groups that carry out these acts. Do you think that, and this doesn't require legislation, do you think there is any chance that the U.S. would consider placing, like based on these criteria that we've been discussing today, place them on that list because the sanctions are much higher, there are much greater repercussions for these countries, and it seems like that would be an effective way for the U.S. to step in?
Yes, I think that would be an appropriate response, but it needs to be tied to several other observations made earlier today. For example, OSCE is not an effective means of monitoring anything in the non-laws. You need about 3,000 people, not 300. I'm not disparaging the bravery of some of those people, but also by the way, there's Russians on those units, and the Russians go into Ukrainian, visit a Ukrainian position, and they sit there and put the coordinates of Ukrainian stuff. Two very small parts in Ukraine are controlled by OSCE, are limited to OSCE observation on the Ukrainian side. 50% 50% of the border they can't even get access to. Huge swaths, roughly a third of the Donbass, but they have to give advance warning to. Of course, by the time they announce it several months in advance, by the time they go visit some concern, some facility, it's nice and clean. Even then, they still catch a lot of stuff. So the Minsk is as currently implemented in terms of the observation and enforcement is ineffective. Point two. The Minsk clock shouldn't start until the violence stops. So Putin keeps this, Ukraine's not keeping us part of the Minsk Amendment. Wait a minute. You can't have elections. You can't have reconciliation as long as there's this level of violence going on. And it's very intense. Right? Who's negotiating? The separatists have Russia as their surrogate negotiator in the Normandy Forum. Where's Ukraine got? France and Germany. And they're not very good stand-up guys. They are not equal to that task as a counterpart to Russia. So if you were going to do this, I think one would say, you want to combine it and say, Russia, we're getting back, we're going to be joining the Normandy. And by the way, the hell with Normandy, let's call it Budapest Forum. 4 signatures on Budapest. Now, these are the serious guys. And British Parliament told me that you lead, we'll follow. No, us Britain, Ukraine, and Russia. And by the way, we're going to increase or replace, or you can have it your way and keep this up, and we're going to declare you as a member, as a state-sponsored terror. I think by combining that, you may get some. You're not going to get anything. You're only going to get out of the Russians. I've dealt with them in negotiations since